All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So, Chicago in the time of the Chicago World's Fair, the Colombian Exposition. So, Chicago, of course, has to fight because the World Fair is a big thing. If you've ever been to Epcot, you've actually been to something very similar to a scaled down, less impressive version of the World's Fair. And it's not often that people can say, hey, Disney is actually less impressive than this other thing, because there's a whole lot of stuff about presentation that Disney does very well. But the World's Fairs lasted for a very long period of time. And when they were held in a different city in the world, and kind of the rest of the world was invited to come and attend. And they were, first of all, very well attended, and second of all, tended to have new inventions and new things introduced, and it was showcases for all these different countries and things, and it was just a neat thing to do. As a matter of fact, it so impressed this guy named Walt Disney that he built Epcot around the idea of what a World's Fair had been. And as a matter of fact, if you are at Disney World and you ride the Carousel of Progress, the Carousel of Progress was actually featured at a World's Fair here in the United States. So Walt was fascinated by them much later on than we're talking about, and recreated the idea that, much like in the Chicago Exposition, you could kind of walk 50 or 100 feet and be in a different country. So World Showcase at Epcot is a mirror of the original kind of version of that, which you'd see in a World's Fair. Now, the reason this one's called the Colombian Exposition is it is being held in honor of the 400th anniversary of the, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue kind of thing. So that's their theme. So it's kind of like, what do you stamp on your merch if you have this event happen all the time? So if the World's Fair is going to happen, periodically, what makes the World's Fair different and kind of brandable? And the branding, just like the Olympics, has to do with primarily where it is. So every time it's held in a different spot. And then that place chooses the theme. Like, when they had it in Calgary, they had like a little flame guy, and when they had it in Barcelona, I think it was a dog. So the Olympics gets to like pick their mascot. Likewise, the World's Fair, you chose a theme. So this one here in 1892-3 is the Colombian Exposition. So initially, Chicago is not first of all, they're not a lock. The idea that they are going to be chosen to be the site of the World's Fair is very slim. Now, it's the US's turn. So the World's Fair is going to be held in the United States. It's just going to have to determine which of our cities is going to host. Now, if you remember from your Great Fire reading, in 1871, Chicago's gutted. And so they lose a lot of what was Chicago and are forced to rebuild. Now, they do so in a rather grand scale, and like you read, there's some changes made to try to keep that from happening again, because catastrophic fire is a problem in the, well, frankly, pre-1900s. But by 1885, they not only kind of rebuilt, but they were really starting to change some other issues as well. One of the things they did that was kind of a move forward rather than a fix something from the past, they looked and said, well, we'd like to have skyscrapers like they have in New York. But New York has bedrock. In other words, if you dig down, you eventually hit like solid rock, and you can put huge buildings like you see in New York on it because it's a solid foundation. Chicago is right on the shores of Lake Michigan and is pretty swampy. So you couldn't, or at least that was the thought, until 1885. In 1885, they realized that you could drive piles, large columns. So you use those as your supports. You could drive those deep, deep, deep into kind of the swamp, and then you could build your structure on top of those piles that you had driven. And so Chicago ends up with a 10-story building, and it's steel framed. So they end up with the first steel framed 10-story skyscraper. And people are like, whoa, that's a 10-story building. That's crazy. In Chicago, which is a swamp. So they're already starting to kind of impress people with their ingenuity and engineering skill when they make their bid for the fair. Now, at the time, Chicago's also kind of a hub of industry, and there's a lot of money and power in Chicago. So you have Marshall Field, which to us, being from Florida, Marshall Field doesn't really mean anything. But if you were to say Marshall Field or Marshall Fields to the kind of Midwest area of the United States, people would know exactly what you're talking about. Now they've since been bought out by Macy's, probably I think the last 10 years. But at the time, Marshall Field is a guy, and he starts a store like no one had really ever seen, where instead of you have, a couple aisles of this and a couple aisles of that, and kind of a general store type feel, he makes a huge store. And he basically says, look, if you go into kind of this room, they'll be like, this will be ladies' wear. And if you go to this other floor, there'll be men's wear. And it'll be separated by department. This is literally where we get our idea of a department store. So anything like a JCPenney, Sears, even things like Walmart, where you have separated by departments. All of those are based on this model created by Marshall Field. Also, if you've ever heard the expression, the customer is always right, that's him too. So huge endowments to the University of Chicago. He gave a lot of money to the University of Chicago, and also establishes what's called the Field Museum in Chicago, which is a really world-renowned museum even to this day. So Marshall Field, very big deal, a lot of money, a lot of power. Philip Armour, Armour canned meats. Chicago is kind of the hub of the meat processing and packing industry in the United States at the time. Armour canned meats makes some innovations in how you can process meat for canning, and also spun off things into like soaps, because a lot of soaps are actually pork byproducts. And so you Dial soap, for example, is made by the Armour Corporation. Armour is responsible for a lot of like canned things, like tinned hams and things of that nature. So Philip Armour, once again, a lot of money, a lot of purchasing power, a lot of mercantile kind of elite. So Marshfield and Philip Armour, those two alone probably couldn't have pulled this off. But Chicago didn't just have those two. You also had Gustavus Swift. Now, Swift is kind of the guy who kickstarts the packed meat industry like half a generation before this. And so Swift is really the one who's turning Chicago in the last half a generation into the main hub for meat packing. Add to the, so once again, meat, mercantile power, a lot of money. Cyrus McCormick. If you talk about tractors, yes, there are like blue and yellow tractors, but most farmers in this country have an opinion on green tractors or red tractors. And those are kind of the ones that people talk about. Even non-farmers know that tractors come in green and red, man. And green tractors are John Deere tractors, which Deere is another one from the 1800s. And red tractors are International Harvester tractors, or McCormick tractors. So McCormick at this point has already kind of kick-started the farming, like mechanization of farming, with International Harvester. And so McCormick, that company, has money, has power. You have Charles Yerkes, who created the L in Chicago, the elevated line, essentially. They wanted a subway system. And of course, the problem with having a subway system in Chicago is, well, first of all, you're not New York. You don't have bedrock that you can tunnel through. You're living in a swamp. So if you dig down Chicago, you hit like swampy water gross. So they couldn't do that. So he had worked on the London Underground and designed that. And he was like, we'll do the same idea, but we'll put it above ground. So Chicago has an elevated line, the EL, elevated line, the L. So the idea is that it's a subway that just happens to not be sub anything. It's above the street. That way you could, run your carriages and eventually your horseless carriages underneath as the cars went around. And then George Pullman. Pullman was a huge railroad magnate, kind of one of the captains, one of the barons of the railway industry. And he created the Pullman Sleeper Car. One of the reasons people didn't particularly love long train trips is if you were super wealthy, you were like, well, I'm in this little compartment, and yeah, it may have a bed, but it's not super comfy and luxurious. Well, he creates the Pullman Sleeper Car, which is essentially like a luxury hotel, but in a train car format. So if you are somebody who would pay to, sail cross Atlantic on a liner, like eventually like the Titanic in the 1900s, the wealthy and powerful really take a shine to the Pullman Sleeper Car. And so all of these guys are in Chicago at this time and are available to kind of go, we really, really want the World's Fair here in Chicago. And so even with these guys, it's still not a lock, because the guys backing New York's play are some of the wealthiest guys in the world. As a matter of fact, some of them are still some of the wealthiest guys in history. We're going to talk about them as we talk a little bit more about the Gilded Age after this. But New York's backers are J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and William Waldorf Astoria, or Astor, the guy who built the Waldorf Astoria. They pledge $15 million to finance the fair if Congress decides to place it in New York. These other guys in Chicago were like, well, all right, let's try to figure it out. Can we kind of even do that money? In the end, Chicago's first national bank president, Lyman Gage, had the ability to raise an additional $5 million in just 24 hours. And he's like, oh, we don't have enough? Give me 24 hours. Boom, here's an extra $5 million. They're like, you raised $5 million in 24 hours? He's like, yes, I did. Congress is like, all right, Chicago, this one's yours. So the exposition is going to run from October 21st of 1892 until October 30th of 1893. So as long as you remember that it starts in 1892, that 400th anniversary of Columbus, you'll be fine. But you will realize that, when we talk about it, there's a lot of things that happened in 1893. That just means it's kind of the second half of the fair. Not really a big deal. So the cities that were in competition, really the one it came down to, New York was the closest competitor, New York City. But additionally, Washington, D.C. and St. Louis were all kind of vying for the honor. And at this point in time, a lot of times St. Louis gets overlooked. But in the even in the early to late 1800s, St. Louis is an important spot. And as you move closer to 1900, St. Louis becomes very, very important. And so the fact that St. Louis is not chosen over Chicago is a very big deal. Now, this is dedicated as a celebration of Columbus's arrival in the New World. And for Chicago, it's a time to kind of, first of all, show the world, look, we aren't out of the game. This is 21 years after the Great Chicago Fire, which is essentially, unfortunately, worldwide news about Chicago, but not good. So Chicago essentially is infamous. So there are people who hadn't really heard a lot about this place called Chicago, Illinois in the United States, who the first time they hear about it is because of this devastating fire. Now, so you got 21 years after that. This is only 28 years after the end of the Civil War. So the nation, in a lot of ways, is still nursing a lot of hurts from that, because you still have tons of people alive who are Civil War veterans. You have tons of people alive who are have been directly affected by the Civil War, either by losing a spouse or a son or what have you, or an arm or a leg. So all these things are still there, and a lot of those hurts are there, and you're going to plop this fair, this party, in the midst of that. Now, May 1st of 1893, Grover Cleveland actually comes to kind of witness the, and boop, start the fair. They have him press a button and it lights up, because electricity is still kind of a really new and impressive thing that not everybody has. And so thousands gather to witness President Grover Cleveland light the fair and start it all off in Jackson Park. So the fair is going to be designed before this by Frederick Law Olmsted, who I call Flo. Just like the lady on the Progressive commercials, but nobody else calls him Flo. So I will call him Flo, but don't go on into high school and be like, yes, the most famous landscape architect in American history is definitely Flo. Unless you explain. If you're like Frederick Law Olmsted, people be like, oh yeah, of course. So he is the father of American landscape architecture, arguably one of the most important landscape architects of all time. Designs a ton of things. Initially, the idea of state parks is still kind of a newish idea. And so it's not that they didn't exist, but they didn't exist like we are used to seeing them, where there's a plan. So state parks in the earlier part of the 1800s were just places that were pretty, and they were set aside for public use. What happens with Frederick Law Olmsted is he comes in and he goes, that's great, but if we guide nature, if we have an intelligent design for this park space, wouldn't that be better? Because, of course, taking inspiration from God, he's like, look, God plants the garden. So let's use all of nature and let's plant the garden. Let's use the facilities and the brains that God has given us to lay out something beautiful. So the oldest state park in the United States is actually the Niagara Reservation on Niagara Falls on the New York side. That's designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. He then proceeds to have a very strong career in New York. He is an East Coaster. Highland Park in Rochester, Central Park in New York City, which Central Park is a huge deal to this day. Prospect Park, also in New York City. The Biltmore Estate and Biltmore Village in Asheville, North Carolina, which is a huge, big deal to this day because it's the largest private American home. It's America's castle. You have a bunch of parks in New Jersey. He designed the United States Capitol Building Gardens. So when you go to the Capitol Building where the legislature meets and everything else, the gardens around that were designed by him. You go to the National Zoological Park, the Smithsonian Zoo in Washington, D.C. That was designed by him. So this is, how the pathways run, which plants you plant, all that stuff, all the minutia, the little tiny details that we tend to just, when his job was done well, and of course he didn't do his job poorly ever, but his goal was that you would look at that and you would just say, wow, that is so amazing. This is such a beautiful place. And not even think about the fact that this little old dude had been planning where every walkway was going to go, how high every hill was, what the trees were going to look like during different seasons, all these different things that he kind of would super plan down to the tiniest detail. So did a ton of college campuses, Auburn, Colgate, Cornell, Gallaudet. If you look in the slideshow, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples I am not going to go over all of them. Stanford, University of Chicago, Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, UCal Berkeley, University of Chicago, University of Rochester in New York, Washington University in St. Louis, Yale University. So tons and tons and tons of these. Also, so you travel around the country and you do all these things for these colleges and these municipalities, these cities and states that would have them build parks. And so he is contracted to come and fix the space that they have, Jackson Park. It's right on Lake Michigan, but it is super, super swampy. And they need more land than they have. Essentially, you do have some parts of it that are firm ground, but then it kind of devolves into swamp. And they're like, that's not going to work for our plan. We need somebody who can fix this. So he actually comes in early on in the process, and he essentially has to terraform the entire place, to like change the structure of everything, which that's totally doable for him. So if you look on the slideshow, hop over to like slide 14. That gives you an idea of the scale that he's used to dealing with. I've got some college campuses in there. Cornell, the hills there that I have in the picture, that hill is artificial. That hill was built to have the tunnel there by Frederick Law Olmsted. If you look at slide 16, Miami University, Miami of Ohio, the trees he planted, he chose so that in the autumn, when they changed colors, when the kids were coming to school in the fall, the colors of the leaves would complement the colors of the bricks. When I say tiny details, like that was this guy's bread and butter. In Central Park, 843 acres. It's huge. It's huge. Some very interesting bridges. Just in general, a very beautiful tableau that he has managed to create in the midst of just the hustle and bustle and busyness of New York. If you hop down to slide 20, you can see it's like you have New York, just this crush of gray building, and then it just stops. And then you have Central Park. And so Central Park, all of the things in there, it's all planned by Frederick Law Olmsted. So even like the giant water features and the smaller water features, all that is laid out by him. So he is more than capable of the task they put him up to. He does some kind of cool, crazy things. He basically reroutes part of Lake Michigan to create like a river, and he has an island that he makes, and then he has canal systems that he puts through it. And then he's like, what would look great here is white neoclassical buildings. So neoclassical buildings are buildings that look like the U.S. Capitol, that look like the Library of Congress or the Lincoln Memorial, things that look like the Parthenon in ancient Greece. So big, tall columns and white exteriors. So they're going to fake it. They don't have enough time, and frankly, they don't have the money it would take to build these buildings out of stone. So what they're going to do is they're going to fake it. So they're going to do steel framing, because remember that whole thing about the skyscraper, they built a 10-story skyscraper with steel framing. So that's what Chicago's going to do. They're a rail hub. It's very easy for them to bring in steel from Pittsburgh. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to bring in steel, and they're going to steel frame these buildings out. And then for the exterior, they're going to cover them with stucco, like plaster. And they're just going to add, you can make a brilliant white paint with lead when, at the time that's still okay. And so they're going to use lead white. So it's going to be a very brilliant, shiny white paint. And that is going to contrast with the city of Chicago, because Chicago is made with primarily gray stone at the time. So their local indigenous stone is kind of a dark gray color. And so you're going to have the old city, and that's going to be the dark gray backdrop. And then here in this new city that they're creating, You're going to have this brilliant, shiny white exteriors on everything. And then it's all going to be lit with electric street lights. And so because of this, it comes to be known as the White City. Now, if you hop down to slide 23, you can see in that's the plan of the Chicago Exposition after it was built, kind of a top-down view. If you were in a hot air balloon, what you would see. So there's little pools and lagoons on kind of the bottom left-hand corner, not the triangle. The triangle, that's actually Lake Michigan. The thing that kind of looks like a loop near the bottom left-hand corner is a moving walkway. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Those big ships you see out there, those are in Lake Michigan as well on the bottom. That huge building we're going to talk a little bit more about as one of the largest buildings ever constructed to that point. Way back in the center, at the very, very top of the illustration, you see something standing straight up. That is the world's first Ferris wheel. In the very center of the building, you do see an island. That's the artificial island that I was talking about. And so you've got this really just very interesting thing that he laid out. Now, if you go down one more, that will give you kind of a turned this way view of the one that's just above it, but a more detailed plan where it'll list for you everything that's there. And then kind of on the left-hand side, you get that rectangle coming out is the Midway. And on slide 25, you'll have a blown up view of that. So the Midway, just like in a carnival Midway, it's designed for money making and entertainment. The idea is that guests will be able to explore exotic scenes and see cultures and people that they haven't before. Now, time out. There are all these different places in the main fair. Buildings like this is France's building, and you can go in there and everything else. This is Germany's building. Okay, so I go in there. But those are primarily for learning and like experiential learning. You're like, wow, look at all this stuff. Oh, wow, I haven't, experienced this culture this way before. And the Midway is going to be kind of more, less walk around museum style, more let's play with it experiential learning, or like let's watch a neat show and acrobats or something like that. So in the main fair, you're going to have a chance to kind of see all the things that you would think Epcot. You walk through and you see like the recreations of buildings and things like that. In the Midway, it's going to be kind of more gamified. So the idea being that you can have a little bit more fun. Now, even though if you look, the Midway's reasonably small. I mean, it's pretty wide, but if you look at slide 24, in terms of overall area, it's not huge. But that slice of the pie, that area just in the Midway alone generated over $4 million. You're like, okay, $4 million. Yeah, $4 million in 1893. So just the Midway games and attractions generated more than $114 million in today's money. So, kind of a big deal. It's a mile-long strip. So even though it is just that little rectangle, that's still a mile, which kind of puts in perspective the whole map. And it's going to kind of bridge the gap from the White City into the city of Chicago. So it's kind of like you move from the old city through the Midway play area, and then you get kind of into the more serious, let's learn about stuff part of the fair. And you're like, hey, why would I want to learn about stuff? Because this stuff is cool, man. This isn't like, you're like, oh, this is boring stuff I don't want to learn about. Remember, this is the World's Fair. This is like cutting edge technology that nobody's ever seen. So as hyped as people get, when, Steve Jobs was alive and he'd have a big event and they'd do the reveal on, the new iPhone or the new iPod from a zillion years ago, and everyone would be like, oh my goodness, it's the iPod Nano. Oh, okay, it's that, but magnified to a huge level, an amazingly huge level, because first of all, there's not any television or anything like that. So you can't be like, oh, let's just tune in and see what Steve has to say. You had to physically be there to actually engage with it. So you could see things that nobody else could see. Now the fair, they do the turnaround on it after they win the honor is really, really fast because it has to be. Essentially, they're awarded the ability to have the fair in Chicago, and then they're told, look, you got to be ready by now, so you don't have a lot of time. So they have to build it in 3 years. And to give you an idea, 633 acres total is what they do. For comparison's sake, that is 5.9 times the size of the Magic Kingdom. So it's big. If you've ever been out to California, been to Disneyland, it's 5.7 times bigger than that. So the White City transforms Jackson Park, that kind of swampy, gross, muddy area on Lake Michigan, into this ideal civilization that has lagoons and little tiny bays, canals, and gorgeous landscapes and awe-inspiring buildings. And some of the buildings are just absolutely huge, literally at the time, bigger than any building on Earth. And some people were so overwhelmed by it, it literally brought them to tears. The manufacturers building, that was that giant building I told you we were going to talk more about, was so large that it could have easily accommodated the Eiffel Tower, which was the centerpiece of the 1889 Paris World's Fair, Paris Exposition. And by the way, it's only supposed to be temporary, but it's still up, whatever. Good job, Eiffel. So if you were to take the Eiffel Tower and lay it down, the building could contain that rather easily. In fact, at its length of 1,687 feet, it could even hold Chicago's Sears Tower, which is a landmark now, which was completed in 1973 and remains the tallest skyscraper in the U.S. It's a really big building. So, there are 400 buildings they have to construct to pull the fair off. They construct these 400 buildings in the White City and in the Midway Plaisance. It takes them 40,000 workers, give or take. It's a little more than that for most of the fair construction. 18,000 tons of iron and steel. That's 36 million pounds. 75 million board feet of lumber. They are building a new city. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, that giant one we just talked about, included over 40 acres of exhibition space. It was over 230 feet tall. At the time, it was the largest enclosed building that had ever been built on Earth. It's kind of a big deal. So, from May 1st to October 31st of 1893, during the period of the worst financial panic that Americans had experienced up to that point, the fair still managed to entertain 27 million people. So from May to October, a 5-month period. To give you guys a comparison, in 2007, Disneyland welcomed 14.9 million visitors in a year. So they did 27 million people when you couldn't just hop on a plane to get somewhere. 27 million people in 5 months. Disneyland, like 15 million in a year. On Chicago Day, which was kind of the day for where residents got a discounted ticket if you lived in Chicago, the fair hosted more than 700,000 people on that day alone. Most people who came to the fair came by train. Chicago was a rail hub that made it very easy to take a train from most places and get to Chicago. You didn't have to stop somewhere and then go by train and then hire a car, a carriage to take you somewhere. So that was not an issue. You could take your train right to Chicago. Most people paid 50 cents for admission. 50 cents is super cheap. Well, 50 cents was a lot less cheap then than it was now, but it was within the realm of normal people. You just had to, save your pennies a little bit. The 14 main buildings, the biggest 14 buildings, provided 63 million square feet of space and housed more than 65,000 exhibits. There were more than 30 buildings that showcased the states and the territories of the United States at that point, and 19 foreign nations also participated in the fair. So if you recall, this is post-Civil War by half a generation, 28 years. Here you have most states have a building there, because travel, even though it exists and you do have rail travel and things like that, people aren't like going on a tour of the United States and going to all of the US. But here you could really take a crack at it. Now, there was no way to see everything at the fair in a day, and so visitors would often pay for multiple admissions and come back multiple days. And you would even stay safe in the park after dark, because they had their very own police force. This wasn't like, oh yeah, we have some security guards. No, they had an actual police force called the Colombian Guard that had been commissioned and built specifically to police the fair. And over 120,000 incandescent lights to illuminate the grounds, which meant that this place was lit up better than most places in the entire nation, arguably than any place in the entire nation. If you look at number 31, slide 31, you'll see some admission tickets, a number of different versions there. Yes, they do look a little bit like money. That's so that they were hard to counterfeit. You didn't want people to counterfeit tickets. You didn't want people selling fake tickets or anything like that. A lot of firsts, like any World's Fair, you do have a lot of firsts introduced, because that's kind of one of the big points. You have, for the first time, squished pennies, elongated coins, where you turn the crank, turn the crank, turn the crank, and it spits out your penny. And you're like, I have a souvenir and it only cost me 51 cents. Well, back in the day, elongated coins, when they're introduced the first time, they don't cost you anything. You just put your penny in, and it squishes it and gives it back. You're not getting charged 50 cents to squish your penny. Woohoo! So I guess it costs you a penny. You can't spend it anymore. So it's penny. Yay! Cracker Jacks, like the food, with the box and the toy inside. No, it's usually not a toy. No, it's something bleh, like a stick-on tattoo. Hershey's chocolate bars, cream of wheat, which is, I guess, technically a hot cereal. Gross. Bleh. It's like really, really bad oatmeal. Juicy fruit gum. Yes, juicy fruit gum is that old. Shredded wheat cereal, which tastes like it's that old. The first powered dishwasher. They had dishwashers that existed before this, but they weren't powered. So you had ones where like you could plug in the water and turn it on and like it sprayed. But this one, you plugged in the water and you turned it on and like the spray moved, because the water pressure generated, rotational action of the water. There we go. The first Braille printer, so someone who was not blind could type stuff and it would print in Braille rather than like English letters. And of course, the first Ferris wheel. Now, the Ferris wheel is going to be the centerpiece, much like in the previous World's Fair, the Eiffel Tower was. The goal was to, quote, out Eiffel Eiffel. They wanted something more impressive than the Eiffel Tower. And by all accounts, people were more impressed with the Ferris wheel than the Eiffel Tower. You're like, dude, it's just a Ferris wheel. Oh no, first Ferris wheel was a lot more than you're thinking. So the dishwasher, there you have a look at it. So you turn on the water, and the water pressure alone actuates the water to go, kind of like a sprinkler, and it washes the dishes. As a matter of fact, the lady who made the dishwasher was tired of her kitchen help, her servants, like kind of wrecking her fine china. So she was like, well, I'll just make an invention that lets me do it, and I'll handle it myself. So kind of a cool thing. She ends up founding what will become the KitchenAid Corporation. So that's kind of a big deal. They're still around today. So Cochrane is kind of famous for that. She was related to some famous inventors, kind of a neat lady. Exhibition buildings. So the kind of the biggest buildings, the most impressive exhibition buildings are going to be the administration building, the electrical building, fine arts building, the fisheries building, the horticulture building, manufacturers and liberal arts building, the music hall, the transportation building, and the women's building. Yes, ladies, you got your very own building. So the administration building, to give you guys an idea, if you jump down to slide 35, these main buildings, now the administration building, by comparison to the other ones, is rather small because you have like the manufacturing and liberal arts, which is absolutely massive in scale. But even this building, if you look at the size of the people, these are not tiny, which is why they had steel frames. These are very large constructions. So outside the administration building, you have a statue called Columbus taking possession of the Americas. Kind of the neat thing is, because this is post-Civil War, and even during the Civil War, we had photography. So this is almost 30 years post-Civil War. So you've had 3 decades of improvement to photographic technology. So we do have some nice, crisp, clean pictures. We have a lot of pictures because the cost per picture had gone down, and the time it took for an exposure had gone down as well. So you could take a picture and you didn't get that blur if people moved a little bit as much as you had in earlier generations. So if you look at 37, this is the Palace of Fine Arts, kind of almost a whimsical castle feel. And just the sea in front of it, that is all people, because it was packed. South portal of the Arts Building, if you look, those are some canals. And if you're looking at them going, hey, those look like the gondolas that they have in Venice. They are exactly like the gondolas that they have in Venice, complete with, in some cases, Venetian gondoliers. So the Art Palace by night, you did have the canals set up to have the gondoliers take people around. Just kind of a neat way to tour the fair. They had a rather large, one of the larger telescopes in the Americas at the time, Yerkes telescope. This was available for public viewing. You could actually climb that set of stairs and go and use this super powerful telescope, which most people, even today, have not had a opportunity to use a researcher grade telescope. And I did not have that experience until I went to university and had a university astronomy class where they're like, you'd like to come out for class, we'll be here and we'll use the observatory's telescope. So most people do not have that experience, and this was a time where people could actually go and have that experience and kind of carry that forward with them. The Palace of the Fairer Sex, the Woman's Building. In other words, ladies, you're nicer than guys. So that had a bunch of things that might be of interest to ladies. So innovations and things that would affect people who were primarily at that time still working out of the home, working as teachers, some of those things. So you did have more women in education post-Civil War than you had before it. So there is some transition into the career world for women. Your goal was not necessarily to find a man as much as it had been pre-Civil War. You also had a dearth of men for a while after the Civil War of marriageable age, because remember, lots of them died during the Civil War. So if you look 42, it talks about the Transept Portal. Transept is a term that we get from cathedral design. A transept is kind of the crossbar in a cross-shaped cruciform cathedral. So the music hall is the building that is closest to the pier that extends out into Lake Michigan. The music hall had a lot of really kind of cutting edge, avant-garde, pushing the envelope performers. Things like famous black musicians played. Horticulture, which was not super common for black musicians to play for white audiences on that scale. The horticulture building. This is going to be stuff about like plant science. So it's going to be everything from this is going to affect your farmers on up through, oh, so you say you're super wealthy and you have a rose garden. Well, have we got a deal for you? Fisheries building. This is going to be kind of half aquarium, half aquaculture technology. So this is going to be, so you're a fisherman, commercially, interesting. But also this is going to be like, oh, so you keep fish in your pond at home. Oh, you don't keep fish, but you'd like to see weird fish from around the world. Absolutely. So that's the fisheries building. The electrical building at night, super lit up, had a kind of faux lighthouse even. And if you look at that center section of the building, it's kind of depicted just left of center. On the slide, it's lit up in very gold. That is because that is all gold leaf, because gold leaf is very shiny when you hit it with light. And so electric light and gold leaf together were super impressive, and a thing that many people hadn't seen. Because unless you were wealthy, you didn't have gold leaf in your home. And unless you were wealthy, you had not seen this many electric lights in a place. Actually, for many people, even the wealthy, unless you were from one or two places in the United States, nothing was lit up like this. And even the places that were lit up like this weren't like shiny, brand new, white painted buildings that reflect the light everywhere. So the statue that is kind of hard to see in slide 47 is not much better in slide 48, but it does give you your caption. That's Benjamin Franklin, because they're going to give him the nod as kind of the father of electricity in this country. Once you go inside the electricity building, it's going to have all kinds of things, not only electric lights and electric powered equipment, things like electric motors and all of that kind of thing. Remember, electric cars are a thing at this point. So this is the transportation building. Transportation building is going to have all kinds of stuff like new technologies in transportation, be that train or things like electric cars, new technology for automobiles or horseless carriages, as is still a common phrase at this point. By the time you get down to slide 52, the Café de la Marine, the sea cafe, this is a giant seafood restaurant. And so it served fish, it served oysters, and for many people in the Midwest, this is their first taste of seafood. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean that they didn't eat any fish. I grew up in the Midwest. We ate fish, but we ate things like walleye and pike. We hadn't had the fish that you guys have down here, like dolphin fish and snapper and grouper, seafood, saltwater fish. So this is the first taste for a lot of these people of saltwater fish, because the Midwest only has fresh water around it. The Grand Court lit up at night. You do see the lighthouse that they kind of kept burning all night, all these lights that they kept on, just so it's kind of this glowing city even at night. Court of Honor by moonlight. You can see everything still lit up beautifully, even though the fair is closed. You can tell it's closed because there aren't people everywhere. So at the very, kind of end of the evening, people have left the fair for the day, everything's shut down, and there you have it. So you were allowed to stay quite late in the evening, but eventually they kind of kick you out so that you couldn't stay overnight and just like not pay for admission the next day. If you look east from the Grand Court, you have a picture where you see a statue that you see depicted from the back. We're going to talk more about that statue in a little bit. Also some great neoclassical things like that arch in the background. Slide 56, you have a replica of Christopher Columbus's 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And the building behind that is actually a building that was cut. All these buildings did not exist before the fair. Remember, Jackson Park was just empty land. So they built this. It's the Friary of La Rabida. Before Columbus managed to come on his trip, he tried to convince the King and Queen of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, Fernando y Isabella, to fund his journey, of course. And they didn't really want to, if you recall, from when we talked about the explorers. So they end up kind of just shunting him off to talk to some really well-educated monks at the Friary of La Rabida for 2 years. So after 2 years, the monks finally bring him to see the queen. So that's all recreated here for visitors to go on. They can go on the ships, they can go on La Rabida, they can see what all this is all about. And that's kind of one more nod to Columbus besides the statue in front of the administration building. So, Court of Honor has that kind of huge lake in it. This is not a natural lake. It clearly is an artificial lake. You know, it kind of has the seawalls and whatnot, and it's meant to look very controlled. But it leads right out to Lake Michigan. So you have the Lake Michigan, of course, as one of the Great Lakes, is in a freshwater sea. You know, so it's not that you don't have grand water in terms of size. The Midwest does. They have freshwater seas. But remember, no seafood because no salt water. Transportation building, large building again, because you had things like rail cars in it to show off. So you needed a lot of space. The women's building, fine arts building, just kind of going through those are just vast. The machinery hall is going to focus on mechanized inventions and things to show people that have machinery that's either steam, electric powered, man powered, horsepower. It doesn't matter as long as it's mechanical. So that golden statue that you see every time we talk about the Grand Court Lagoon is called Republic. And there is a replica of it in Chicago. But it was so big that when they made the replica, they were like, let's make it a little bit more like this. And so the replica that still stands is only 1/3 of the size. If you're wondering what happened to a lot of these statues were made with precious metals and they survived for a while, but then people were like, you know, normally we make statues out of bronze, which is really cheap. And we made this statue and covered it with gold, and like a lot of it, not just the little like leaf gold, like, or they'd say things like, this is a solid silver statue and silver is super expensive. It's not anymore, but at the time, silver and gold used to be like, you know, a lot closer in value than they are. Great historical reason for that. Somebody ruined that for the world. Slide 66. The Krupp gun building, Krupp gun factory from Germany, Deutschland. Krupp was a manufacturer of really big guns. I don't mean like guns that, you know, people carry. These are guns that are carried by rail cars. These are guns that are called coastal guns, where it's literally like built into the side of a mountain on your, you know, coast, so that if ships approach, you can shoot like battleships and destroy them. These are giant guns. And they're here, first of all, to kind of show off. But second of all, this is a sales pitch, because everyone who comes to the World's Fair is going to see this. And a lot of them are going to be people who have connections to government, not only here in the United States, but in other countries. And that's going to be an opportunity for them to go back to their places and say, you know, I saw a gun that would keep our country safe. So it cost the Krupp company more than $1 million to stage this, to have this happen. And it was a good investment for them. So this is, you got to think of that in terms of scale. Like, this is gobs and gobs of money. So it included, they brought a coastal gun that had a bore of 42 centimeters. That's 16 inches. It's like basically as wide as my camera angle is. So that means it shoots a projectile, like bullet, that is this wide. So it will put a hole in your ship that is this wide. The projectile, the 16-inch wide projectile and everything else, 2,500 pounds, a little more than a ton. Driven by 900 pounds of brown powder, which is related to black powder, it's a modified version. Could penetrate an iron plate 3 feet thick. So if you happened to have a ship with 3 feet of armor plating, even at 1.25 miles, it would still punch through that and sink your ship. It was nicknamed the Thunderer. It could fire if you put it up in what's called a parabolic arc. It could fire 15 miles, so its max range was 15 miles, which means if you put it on a rail car, you could shoot a city and still be 15 miles away from the city. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, World War I and World War II. Yeah, there's this thing called the Paris gun. Yeah, Germany, Krupp Manufacturing. Yeah. So, on this occasion, John Schofield declared Krupp's guns to be, quote, the greatest peacemakers in the world. In other words, if you had these, nobody is going to attack you. These will end up being the precursor of the company's World War I Big Bertha howitzers, which are, you know, throwing shells that weigh more than a Volkswagen at Paris. So leather and shoe building interior. So this is going to be focused on things like tanning leather and processing leather, and what technology have we had happen with shoes. Remember, you had people like Jan Matzliger in terms of the lasting machine. The Silver Queen is one of a number of really fantastic statues that makes its debut at the fair. It was by a mining company in Aspen, Colorado, and it was in the Mines and Mining Building. So the Silver Queen, to make it more impressive, is a mining company, so they had access to a lot of precious metals. And to quote someone who was there firsthand, it consisted of pedestals on which infantile figures, little tiny babies, in solid silver, poured cornucopias of silver dollars out on the world. So they used actual silver dollars and just kind of like fuse welded them together. They held the lines of a boat with chariot wheels, in which, under a canopy with the staff of office in hand, sat the Silver Queen with her crown of gold. Above her head was a richly made canopy, and on its summit rested an eagle with its wings spread. So very impressive, all silver, all gold, super impressive stuff. If you look, there's a number of slides of the different state buildings that were there. So even Florida had a building, and Florida brought palm trees to Chicago to put outside their building. So, and you have a lot of them kind of mirror the architecture of the place that they are. So Pennsylvania kind of sort of looks like a scaled down Independence Hall. Delaware looks like some of the governor's mansion type stuff. Delaware is kind of the more traditional, like, homes of the affluent. And then Florida actually is modeled on Spanish style forts, like you see at Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine. So those kind of things there. Indiana, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Those buildings are on the next slide. The Indiana building, to give you guys a bit of the scale, they are really huge, even the state buildings. Inside the Minnesota building, to give you guys, once again, that sense of scale, they had a building inside the building. So there is a life-sized figure of a man in a log cabin with a mill on the side. Massachusetts building, New York building, New Jersey, and Connecticut on the next slide. Montana, Washington, Idaho, Arkansas, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah. Then some of the World Showcase buildings. You're going to have Great Britain, Canada, New South Wales. New South Wales means Australia. It's one of the divisions, political divisions within it, and kind of like our states. And then you have India, Montana Justice. This is another one of those huge statues. It's in the Montana building, like you would expect. So under a huge maroon velvet canopy, a 12-foot tall statue of Justinia, Roman goddess of justice, guarded by 2 lions, standing atop a 2-foot sterling silver globe. 2 feet, 24 inches, solid silver globe. All of that rests upon a 2-foot square plinth stand of pure gold. There you go. The gold for the plinth was mined at Spotted Horse Mine in Maiden Canyon, Montana. The silver came from W.A. Clark of Butte, Montana, and Samuel Hauser of Helena, Montana. The statue dominated Montana's pavilion, was one of the must-see items at the fair. I mean, hello, that's just an insane amount of silver and gold. It remains to this day the largest and most expensive silver sculpture ever produced in the world. It was made from a life-size mold created by sculptor R.H. Park of the shapely figure of Ada Rehan. That is not to say she is 12 feet tall. That means they made a life-size mold of her and then scaled it up to 12, so you've got her, and then you've got 4 feet of plinth, because you got the 2 foot of plinth, and then you got the other 2 feet of globe, which gives you your 4 feet. And so they basically scaled her up to 8 feet. And so the Ada Rehan was kind of the actress of her time. She was the it girl. So when you're talking the most beautiful woman in the world kind of thing. So the mold was made of baked French clay buried in the pit. A distinguished group of Columbia World Fair executives, geologists, and foundry workers watched as the molten silver was slowly poured into the mold, and an hour later, a beautiful white metal sculpture was taken from it. At the end of the fair, this statue actually traveled around to various county fairs and stores and eventually ended up in Omaha until 1903, when its owner went, this is an insane amount of money to just be touring around the country, and melted it down. Get silver and gold back. So you have a couple more pictures of it, because pictures were not available in color. You also have a watercolor done of it to show you, the beauty of it. So remember, that's a lot of silver. And the globe is 2 feet, so that can kind of give you an idea of kind of her scale in the grand scheme of things. If you pop down to 81, Ada Rehan is depicted on slide 82. Delaware Building, a little bit closer up. Illinois Building. California also had a statue. She had a bear guarding her footsteps because, if you look at their flag, it's a bear. If you went onto that main island, the wooded island, that they had a mini Japanese village there. And so many in terms of the number of buildings. The buildings were full size. So you had a couple Japanese buildings. Other foreign buildings, you had Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Haiti, Germany, Guatemala, Spain. Spain as also another kind of castle form with some Moorish elements, some Arabesque elements. And then Norway is going to be a model of a staved church. And then the Irish village is going to have kind of scenes that you would see in Ireland at the time. Things like weaving and some other things. So the Ferris wheel is going to be there on the left, and Blarney Castle on the right. Blarney Castle being a model of the one found in Ireland. And the Ferris wheel I want to just talk a little bit more about. If you look at slide 93, this is Old Vienna. So this is a scene from Vienna, and you can see the Ferris wheel in the background, but it doesn't really give you a sense of the scale of the thing. Slide 94 gives you a picture of kind of the view from the Ferris wheel, the administration building, top right-hand corner with that gold-covered roof. Manufacturers and liberal arts is the giant kind of gray-topped, iron-topped building kind of directly in front of you, center right. And then if you go down to slide 95, it shows you a illustration of the Ferris wheel there. So this Ferris wheel is the first Ferris wheel. It's actually constructed by a guy named Ferris. It's Ferris's wheel. And if you look, the cars are train cars. So remember, they're trying to outdo the Eiffel Tower, trying to make something bigger, better, more impressive. So he's like, okay, I can do that. So they mount train cars sideways for better viewing, and then they put them on a giant wheel that then rotates. And it rotates slowly. This is a sightseeing thing. You know, this isn't like this isn't a thrill ride. 2,160 person capacity. And they're filling the cars so that you can look out, not in. So essentially, you even could have had a greater capacity if you were willing to, not worry about that. To give you guys an idea, the London Eye is the largest Ferris wheel in the world. It can hold 768 people at one time. The original Ferris wheel, built for the Colombian Exposition, could hold 2,160 people at a time, which is essentially 3 times the capacity. So, there's that. George Ferris, the guy who made it, was familiar with working in giant constructions of steel because he was a bridge maker by trade. So he also was used to the idea that if I mess up, people will die, because that's something that bridge makers do have to deal with even today, as we saw in South Florida and Miami last year, year before. So he builds this immense contraption to carry these train-sized cars around, and carnivals are never the same after that, because they kind of would scale down Ferris wheels for that impressive, get to the top and wow, I can see so far. So there's another view of the Midway, picture of the Ferris wheel. 98, I said we'd talk about that moving sidewalk. This is just like in the airport, but it went all the way down the pier, did the loop, came back, did the loop. Basically, you could get on, 5 cents. It was a ride. Amusement park rides were a little different then. And so you could ride a moving sidewalk, which the technology to do a moving sidewalk of that size is impressive even today, because we don't do moving sidewalks that size. The long runs that you have at places like Disney and Universal and everything else are not this long a run. And they aren't bi-directional. So this goes, around the loop, and it goes down, and then it goes around another loop, and it comes back. So very impressive. Slide 99 is just one of the many souvenirs that were available to people who came to the Colombian Exposition. It's got Columbus on the front. The coin is made out of aluminum, which, remember, for a while was super, super expensive. So aluminum souvenirs were still considered super fancy and super rare. And it has Columbus on the front, and then the back side has a recessed inset to hold things. So you can put little tiny things in there like a stamp. This one has an unused 2-cent stamp. The glass over it is not glass, so it's probably mica, which is a mineral, a stone that they used for things like lantern glass. So slide 100 shows the Dutch house. It is one of just a handful of surviving buildings from the fair. It now resides in Massachusetts. Most of the fair's buildings didn't survive because, remember, essentially they're stucco and steel, so they weren't meant to survive forever. But then again, the Eiffel Tower wasn't meant to be up for a long time either, and it still is. The issue became, first of all, eventually they're going to have a fire, which is going to destroy a lot of like the stucco and wood. And then the other thing is, this is at the tail end of the 1800s, and in the beginning of the 1900s, you have World War I. So having kind of just like these buildings that aren't being used for the most part, some of them are repurposed. That's steel that you can use for warships and material. Material is materials you need for war. We talked about Daniel Hale Williams and the whole thing about him when we talked about Black History Month. But this is that time period. Like his open heart surgery, that's 1893. Like that is right now. That is this time. You also have some less wonderful things that happened at the fair. America's first really prolific serial killer that we know about is this, same time, and hunting at the fair. Not people in the fairgrounds, but people who are visiting Chicago for the fair because he has a hotel. And then just kind of a lot of other stuff. So many books have been written about this fair that I cannot, even in this hour and 15 minutes, begin to touch on everything that existed. So I do have 4 links. If you guys want to learn more. I'm laughing because those 4 links barely scratch the surface of any of this. There are countless books that have been written about any of these topics. Tesla and Edison had it out kind of right before this, and Tesla ends up with George Westinghouse. And so there's this huge thing about, is the fair going to be lit with direct current or alternating current? And Edison's going, my way is safe and their way's not. And they're going, no, your way isn't safe, our way is. All kinds of stuff. Like Edison electrocuted elephants, and it's nutty. In the end, Tesla wins. And so alternating current ends up being what lights the fair. And if you don't think that's important, plug something into a wall, because that's alternating current, which really, the alternating current, direct current debate comes to a head here at the World's Fair. And in many ways, that is the deciding factor on whether or not we went with direct current, like you see in a car battery, or alternating current, like you see when we plug in stuff to the wall. So, crazy, crazy cool stuff. Really just a very interesting topic. And if you have any questions, let me know. All right, guys. It's been great. Have a good one.